back, JDs and gentlemen, Hosses and Hossettes. What we've got today, Sig Spear LT 300 Blackout. This is a small frame gas gun, chambered in 300 Blackout with a 9-inch barrel. This is it's a carbon steel barrel, not chrome line, nothing crazy special, but you'll probably most recognize this from really pulp culture everywhere. You see this a lot in Call of Duty, you see this a lot in that new TV series, I think SEALs or SEAL Team, whatever it's called. They have it in quite a few of them. Those guys are running a lot of staccatos and running a lot of Sig Spears. Also, the Sig Spear platform is the Army's new choice of firearm to issue out to the infantry. I think in 277 Spear is what they're choosing for a lot of them. But they also come in 5.56, 300 Blackout, 308. There's a lot of different variations of this. And, I mean, let's be honest, this is an incredibly aesthetically pleasing firearm. So, let's get down to it. Here, starting at the top, we have a Griffin M4 SD gate lock suppressor. Dirty cal, obviously. It's kind of an older style non-flow through. Obviously that's not going to help with the gassing, and we'll talk about the gassing on this in a little bit. Working your way back from the muzzle device, we can get to the adjustable gas block. It is a 2-position adjustable gas block, plus and minus, kind of meaning for suppressed and unsuppressed. I ran it in suppressed the entire time for less gas, whether it was suppressed or not, just because of the gas that this gun creates. It's a fair amount. And after you put a can on it, this thing gets violently gassed. Moving down from the gas block, we have the rail. Now, the rail is pretty interesting on this, really. The top portion of the rail is monolithic to the upper receiver, like that of an LMT. So the top portion running all the way out is the same all the way back, tied into the upper receiver, very similar to like an LMT Mars or even their small frames monolithic rail setup, or SCAR for example. The bottom portion of it is what bolts on. Now there's quite a few reports of issues on these that the rail can lose zero, especially running a laser up to as much as 5 mils just by putting some pressure on the handguard and twisting it. So what I have here is a Arisaka makes a mount for the handrail that more securely mounts the two rails together, and there's a U-clamp and a mount on either side. Those clamp together and rigid up that rail quite a bit. I didn't notice any deflection issues when shooting or trying to induce deflection into it with this Arisaka rail mount. Another thing that seems to be a fairly common complaint, and when I say fairly common, obviously the people that get on the internet and complain about their firearms are going to be more prevalent than the ones that get on the internet and are really happy with them, but is the floppy barrel or barrel returning to zero. If you Google that, you can find several points or several threads on that, and basically that is the barrel being loose or kind of wobbly in its mounting to the receiver. And I haven't experienced that one on mine. This one sits very nice and solid, but what would happen is if you apply pressure to the barrel, of course any barrel is going to move a little bit, but it would not return to zero, and it would move more than really is probably acceptable. This one doesn't move any more than is acceptable, and this one also moves to zero. It seems to be the fix for several people, from which I've found, is you'll have to remove the lower rail portion and get to the barrel clamps and torque those to 60 inch-pounds and 40 inch-pounds and higher respectively. I said that backwards. So the barrel needs to be at 60 inch-pounds and the rail needs to be at 40 inch-pounds, and that seems to straighten those guys out. It seems as though there was a batch of these that went out without the proper torque on those, so that is something to be aware of. If you run into it, it's not the end of the world. Working further back, we have an ambidextrous safety, we have ambidextrous magazine releases, and we have ambidextrous bolt release. The controls are pretty intuitive, they're very nice. I actually really like the bolt release and really don't like it at the same time. So, if you could see here at the magazine, or sorry, the bolt release, is kind of just a thin little lever. So I can hold this up, pull it back, and lock that bolt back. I can also drop it from here on the right hand side. It's really nice because it's fairly intuitive. It's right there. I mean, when you index your finger off of the trigger, your finger's already basically riding it. So if you want to lock it, the bolt back, you can really just press up a little bit from where you're indexing your finger. If you want to drop it, you just gently bring it down from where you're already indexed. So it's a really nice place. I didn't have any issues with it because I didn't run it incredibly hard, but it is a very thin piece of metal. I could see this catching, although it is stuck up very close up against the rail, I could see this catching on a piece of kit or bashing against something in hard use, and that being a problem because once it goes here into the receiver, it's already thin right here. You probably can't see it, but right up inside here it gets very thin, and it's just I could see that as a potential failure point. I haven't heard people complain about it, however. Moving down to the rest of the lower receiver, it's very standard AR-esque feeling receiver. The trigger itself is a mil-spec style 2-stage trigger. You can go ahead and ghost it. It's not a Geisley. Geisley makes one for us. I probably ought to have bought one to put in it for the video because I did struggle running this heavy of a trigger. I'm not used to them. So there's quite a bit of take up, and there's probably 6 pounds of take up before you get to your wall, maybe 5. And once you get to your wall, it's a very pronounced wall, and you have to keep pulling till it goes off. So the trigger itself is not gritty. The reset itself is crisp, but to pull back through that wall is probably between 8 and 9. I'd guess around 8.5 pounds. It is a stout mil-spec trigger, and the travel to return is fairly long. Go ahead and dose that one more time. I caught myself when shooting struggling, especially since I'm used to a SSAE or SSAEX from Geisley when shooting small frames or large frames. I found myself very often not letting the reset of my finger go far enough to fully reset the trigger and try to squeeze off another round before it's reset. The distance to let it go all the way is just something I kind of had to train my brain while trying to shoot this fast in any fashion. I think with a trigger, this thing could really run fast, a lot faster than you could with this, or I could with this trigger. But yeah, the trigger is definitely a main complaint. There are fixes out there for it by aftermarket companies such as Geisley, but I didn't have it in this. This is what it comes with, and it's not great. The rest of the lower receiver is tanadized very nicely. Speaking of the tanadizing, I really like the overall colors on it. It's kind of reminiscent of the Scar series, 50 Shades of FDE. It looks very nice, incredibly aesthetically pleasing. There's some different tones in there. This rail is a little bit different of a shade than the upper receiver, which is a little bit different shade of the lower receiver, and it just all kind of blends in and makes for a very aesthetic gun. Also in the lower receiver, we have QD mounts milled and set into the receiver, kind of that reminisce of the original Ambi CAC lowers. I like that. I don't use those QD points. If you do, it's incredibly handy to have them there. If you don't, it kind of reminds me of the old CAC lowers, so I like that. Call me a fanboy. You get back to the rear of the receiver. You have 1913 on the rear, so you can run just about any variation of stock that mounts to that you wish, or with an adapter. It takes some pressure to pull the stock up into its collapsible position, which is nice so it doesn't fold on its own, but folded, this thing is a very short gun. Even by the time you put a can on it, this thing's not very long. I mean, forearm for reference. This is a very, very solid little truck gun, and the cool thing about the system specifically in this is that you're able to fire it with the stock in the closed position, because this is a short stroke gas piston system. We can break apart the receivers here and look at the bolt itself. These pins are very tight, so pardon. Pulls apart standard like a AR-15. This is more like a AR-180 if you're familiar with those. So you have your captured springs here inside of your upper receiver, a shortened bolt, and then you have, man, this is filthy. You have your charging handle, which does not have the standard nook that comes down like an AR. So this actually catches, let me set this down, I'll show you. This actually catches here on this little ridge, and that pulls your bolt back. So your bolt has this large metal piece that comes off the top that attaches to your captured springs and runs back. Speaking of the filth of this gun, I've shot Sig Spears before, and they are a very overgassed platform. I've shot Sig Vertices before, or the MCXs, and I was hoping that this would be fixed in the Spear version. I talked to a buddy that had one of these, and I mentioned the gassing that I experienced on the previous generations, or the previous models. He's like, oh yeah man, Spear, specifically 1 in 300 blackout like this thing's not very gassy at all, runs great. I don't know if he's more of a man than me or not. I do have one clip of slow-mo I can kind of show you the gas that's coming out of this thing, surprise. Even with shooting glasses on, you mag dump this thing, you're going to be crying in front of it. There's no doubt that this thing is a heavily gassed gun. The amount of gas that comes back out of the receiver and blasts you in the face just kind of reaps your skull every single time and burns your eyes badly. It is a horrendously overgassed firearm. Now, I think it probably would help a fair amount if ran a flow-through style suppressor. This is a more older traditional style suppressor. It's not a flow-through suppressor, so you're going to have significantly more back pressure than you would shooting unsuppressed. You don't notice the gas in your face as much unsuppressed because a lot more of those gases are able to escape out the front, but this thing shooting suppressed is atrociously overgassed. What is very surprising though shooting it is even though it is atrociously overgassed, you don't experience much violence in this action. Now, in that slow-mo shot you can kind of hear what is going on inside the receiver and hear the ping and hear that bolt is really rocking at a high rate of speed. But in terms of feel and in the shoulder and holding it in your hands while you're firing, it doesn't translate to that at all. And in fact, compared to some other 9-inch 300 black AR type rifles in a true AR platform, it feels like more of a slug than a slap, if that makes any sense. It's not a sharp recoil impulse. It is a more gentle recoil impulse, but the gentleness also has a little bit of weight behind it. It's kind of like a good old slug from your buddy. And when you shoot it, instead of a quick initial snap, it's more of just a push into your shoulder. It's very linear. The muzzle doesn't really rise, it doesn't really drop. If it does anything at all, it may be a little bit high and to the left, but it's very, very minimal and very, very manageable. It's very easy to follow up shots quickly and get right back on target. It's not violent in the nature where you lose your optic. It's not violent in the nature at all where you lose your optic or you bounce off target while rapid firing or while doing repeated shots on targets. It's a very flat shooting gun, and it's a very pleasant shooting gun. It handles subs and supers absolutely just fine with no issues. The only issues, I ran into it in roughly 1,000 round cadence with no lube.
There's always time for lubricant!
No cleaning, just straight out of the box and running it. Factory grease on it would be, I had one failure to feed halfway through a mag, just failed to feed, and that was that. And the other issue I ran into is, this happened for a fair amount and tried to figure it out, get it on camera, but I quit doing it, was when the magazine would be empty and the bolt would catch, you'd go to insert another magazine, and as you were inserting it, something would catch the bolt and drop the bolt before the magazine was inserted, so it would drop the bolt on a dry chamber. And that happened at least 5 or 6 times, and in trying to troubleshoot it, it fixed itself. Going back through some footage, it looks like the bolt wasn't catching all the way. I'm assuming there's enough carbon and gunk buildup in it that it probably wasn't just allowing it to catch all the way and fully seat the lock in the bolt. And when you'd go to insert the magazine, it'll jiggle around just enough to where it would drop the bolt right before you get your magazine in. Speaking of the bolt and the springs are very authoritative, which is a good thing as gassed as this weapon is. But just dropping the bolt onto a fresh mag, it doesn't have any problem stripping around off of a fully loaded magazine. It drops with plenty of authority, and it just doesn't mess around. It gets straight to the point. Finishing out accessories on this, I did decide to run this with a Surefire weapons light, the standard Zenitco laser I run on most things, just because I've got one. It's cheap. And pressure pad for the light, along with a EOTech EXPS30 and a G45. Specifically, this setup on a Spear LT is kind of a pain in the ass. If you can see here on this side of the receiver, right here behind your charging handle, the quick detach for that flip to the side magnifier gets right in the way of your charging handle. Now, this could be fixed with a Unity riser and a Unity mount for this EOTech. I did not have one handy, so this is how I ran it. And if you had to run and grab your charging handle, you did have to be very diligent to hit the blade on the QD for your magnifier and really try to grab into that charging handle. One of my other annoyances about this specific charging setup is that the pivot point on the stock also gets in the way of the charging handle. So as you're grabbing it and charge it all the way back, you run all the way across it. And as you do that, it really kind of tries to slide your finger or your hand off of that charging handle, and just need to be diligent about it and have a really good grip on it. Otherwise, sometimes it can kind of take you for a surprise, and when you run across it, your foot slides off. In conclusion, I really wanted to like this, and I do, with some hesitations or with some asterisks. Looking at this firearm, it does something to you. Like, sometimes looking at a classic car, it almost has a soul of its own. Aesthetically, this thing is one of the most pleasing firearms I've ever had the chance to own. It is, I just love how it looks. It's very different. Prominent in pulp culture. You've seen it all over Call of Duty. You've used it in there. You've seen it on the TV shows and movies. And it's just different from your standard run-of-the-mill AR. And it's not different in a bad way. It's not different in a space age, laser blasting, Space Force type of gun way. It's just, it's something that looks like form follows function. And I think that they hit a lot of the notes really well on this and missed a few of them. So for a $2,500 rifle, I do expect a lot out of it, and it did perform well. However, my largest complaint is going to be the gassing on this. When I say atrociously overgassed, I mean abhorrently overgassed. I don't know how many more adjectives I can come up with to describe how horribly gassed this thing is. So, at the price point it sits at, it's tough to say if it's worth it to me or not. I think that there's some really other solid 300 blackout options. But I don't know if they're any better or any worse than it necessarily. Knights has a fantastic 300 blackout option, but you're going to be spending quite a bit more on it. I have yet to try the BRN 180 and 300 blackout. I think that would be a very comparable gun to do a comparison on. So that's one I'd like to get my hands on and kind of compare the two side by side and see the differences between those. The price point on the BRN is a little bit less, so it would be very interesting to see how those two line up to each other. PWS makes that for Brownells. In conclusion, I think that this is a absolutely beautiful firearm, and I think that it does perform and function as expected, reliably, and it is other than getting punched in the face by gas every time you pull the trigger, a very pleasant shooting experience otherwise. I need to do some looking and researching and see if the possibility exists out there, if I can send this out and get this barrel regassed, have a new gas system put on it to where it's actually gassed correctly. I would love to keep this and slap it into a pickup when you're running around, and this is the ultimate ranch vehicle gun. It's short, it's fairly light, it shoots well, handles supers and subs phenomenally well. I mean, running around LARPing in your mom's basement or running around out on the ranch, this is a fantastic platform to work with. I just cannot get over the gassing. So I'm going to see if there's an option out there to go ahead and fix that issue. And if there's not, she's probably going to go on down the road. If it stays, it's absolutely, unequivocally getting a trigger and getting a gas job, because this is just, I've hammered the nail plenty. I've beat the dead horse enough. The gassing is horrible. So, a large portion of me and my heart loves the gun, but my brain and my realism does not for that reason, if that makes any sense. So we'll finish off with the real talk session. People are naturally time wasters. 99% or more of people are going to be time wasters for the rest of their lives. They have no ambitions, no goals, no aspirations, no dreams. And if they have any of those things, they don't follow through or take any of the actionable steps necessary to make those come to fruition. In turn, most people also believe that you're the same way and think that because their time is worth nothing, your time is worth nothing. Don't fall into that trap.